Surveillance. What does it all mean, and where are we heading towards? We've been victims, and I say victims of surveillance for the longest time, whether it's through our phones or in the UK, the most surveilled country in the world. We have CCTVs everywhere, and we can be tracked from the moment we leave our home to work and back again. And that includes our shopping habits, who we stop and talk to, and everything. But recently in China, they decided that they're not taking no more. Let me tell you about that. I'm the OBG. So the majority of Chinese people, like us in the West, already believe that their government and the authorities are using all the means at their disposal to gather personal information about them. And according to many, the Chinese government utilises people's devices, private messages, apps, credit cards, and China's surveillance system, which is considered to be amongst some of the most intrusive surveillance systems in the world. And with that, it includes advanced facial recognition properties and installed cameras throughout the country, enabling the government to track down and control whoever they want to track down. And it's directly stripping the Chinese people of their personal freedom. So recent investigations suggest that the Chinese government holds real-time information on close to 3 million people in the west of China, which they update regularly via GPS. And this information contains not only people's names, but also their birth dates, jobs, places of travel to, and even more details of their private lives. And the authorities don't only use facial recognition to document people's daily lives, but they also use advanced surveillance devices that can identify them by their body movements, even if their faces aren't visible. And this is a type of surveillance that is overlooked in the UK. It's rarely reported on as surveillance, but as scientific breakthroughs, and it's often partnered with news about terrorism. Anyway, in China, many activists, influencers, journalists and others made significant efforts to address the growing intrusive surveillance issue, and it escalated, gaining momentum during this year's protests in Hong Kong against an extradition bill proposed by Hong Kong's authorities when the police started identifying and tracking down alleged leaders of the protests, as well as some of the protesters, for many of the previously mentioned privacy disturbing methods. So the public's frustrations in China began in February 2019 when Hong Kong's government proposed a fugitive offenders and mutual legal assistance in criminal matters legislation bill, which the public considered to be an infringement of their freedom and democracy. And according to this bill, the government of Hong Kong would be able to transfer suspects and criminals to mainland China, Taiwan and Macau, where they would face trial under China's laws, which are different to those current ones in Hong Kong. And the critics mostly feared that if this bill was passed, it would entangle and complicate the two legal systems that are still separate. So initially, people began protesting in March and April in continuously growing numbers, but their discontent finally escalated in mid-June when they came together in an enormous gathering of more than 1 million united protesters. The demonstration spanned out of control when the police used violence as standard practice, allowing them to use force, and then they stopped using identification numbers and badges to hide their identities, and finally ended up using tear gas and rubber bullets to reportedly calm the masses. And actions like this are very similar to what we see in the UK and other European countries whenever it kicks off. Anyway, this resulted in the protesters adding a new demand on their list of demands, which was that the police are held accountable for their ferocity in dealing with the protesters and exploiting their power while failing to respect the law they're representing. And once again, this is common in all countries. The police actions are those of paid thugs. They're hired to instill fear in the protesters and to break up the protests by means of violence. So the protesters were furthermore enraged when many police officers removed their identification badges and hid their identities and wore plain clothes amongst the protesters during the demonstrations, while at the same time the police were using advanced facial recognition methods to track down protesters, along with other intrusive methods, allowing them to gather personal information about them. And the authorities allegedly used people's phones, and they accessed them by forcing people to log in with their own facial recognition. And others claim that they saw police officers taking people's phones and checking their photos, messages, calendars, and other private apps. So, to avoid being identified and to protect their privacy, protesters started thinking creatively, which is something we seem to be lacking in the UK, where we tend to turn up, chant a bit, get kettled in, and then shoot off back home. So many of the protesters, they use face masks, and when going out to join the demonstrations, they paid for train tickets by using cash instead of credit cards in attempts to prevent the police from tracking them. And in a show of solidarity, they used lasers and they pointed them at the CCTV cameras, which in some cases can blind them temporarily and in some cases actually cause permanent damage to the sensors. They even went as far as spraying cameras which blocked the capture of broadcasts of their faces to news stations, which helped them to evade identification and eventual imprisonment. So in short, the protesters gave the system a taste of their own medicine. They hid their identities and made their actions secret, then covered their faces and switched their phones off, which made identifying them difficult to impossible. And rather ingeniously, they used an encrypted messaging app named Telegram, where they created a channel named Dad Find Boy with more than 50,000 subscribers. And on that channel, they shared details of the plainclothes officers and their families to let the public and protesters know exactly who they were. And I find that pretty impressive. So we live in an era in which our governments and big businesses are invading our private lives and collecting personal sensitive data through the technology we use on a daily basis. And this is not the way to live in a democratic and supposedly open society. China has taken surveillance, tracking and controlling of people's private lives into a whole new level, and we must not overlook the fact that while we talk about their oppressive regime, we're turning a blind eye to what is happening in our own backyard. If we give over to letting government invade our privacy, we really do have a lot to fear. Be careful what you wish for. I'm the OBG. OBG.